What's up everyone, Solar J here. Today I'm going to show you how I managed to have the LFO perfectly in sync with your external MIDI clock on the Moog Grandmother, and how I make arbitrary time division like 8s, 16ths and LFO for the modulation. If you do not own a Grandmother, you're probably asking yourself, what? You must be kidding me. Of course there must be a way, like a built-in easy way to sync the LFO with an external MIDI clock and make arbitrary time divisions. But if you own a Grandmother or many other Moogs models as far as I know, you probably know that it's not really that straightforward. And you get why I decided to make this video. There are many lost souls out there trying to sync the LFO to a DAW or a MIDI sequencer clock, and I was one of them myself. That's why I want to share the solution that I found with you guys. Without further ado, let's go and get synced. First, let's go super quickly through the setup I have prepared today. I have a MIDI clock coming from my analog rhythm via the MIDI 5-pin input, but it can be any kind of clock form, like via USB from your DAW or from a sequencer. Now when I press play on my rhythm, the arpeggiator gets nicely synced, and it also follows, of course, the tempo changes. So yeah, that's great. But if I put in the LFO modulation, the LFO is still free. It's not synced at all with my external clock. So what can we do about that? Well, in general, to sync the LFO on the Grandmother, we can use the sync in input in the modulation section to force the LFO to restart its cycle every time it gets a clock tick. This is how the sync in works. Let's say you have an LFO at a different frequency compared to your clock. If you input a clock or any trigger signal actually into the sync in, then the LFO will go back to the beginning of its waveform every time the sync in receives a trigger. So let's say you have an LFO at a different frequency than your clock. You can follow the red dashed lines in the diagram to see what happens every time the clock is received by the sync in input. If you have similar frequencies, the LFO has just enough time to almost complete an approximate complete cycle. But if the frequencies are very different, it might happen that between any two clock triggers, the LFO either does not have enough time to finish its cycle, or it has too much time and will complete many cycles between the two triggers. Okay, with the theory out of the way, let's go through the different ways you can achieve LFO sync using the sync in input. This method is quite common knowledge, but let's go through it for completeness. If you have the ARP on and you plug the gate out of the ARP section into the sync in, what will happen is that the LFO will restart its cycle every time the ARP plays a note, because you're sending the gate from the ARP section, so it will restart every time the arpeggiator outputs a note like this. And here you can see the different scenarios discussed in the previous section. When the LFO frequency is similar to the arpeggiator frequency, in this case, arpeggiator rate. When the LFO frequency is higher, so in between two notes it completes many cycles, or when it's lower, so it doesn't have the time to complete a cycle in between two arpeggiator notes. So keep in mind that every time you sync the LFO on the Grandmother with the sync in, no matter what methods you use, you will always have to adjust the LFO frequency manually to taste. It's not automatically matched and locked to the signal that comes into the sync in. The problem with using this method is that you are forced to use the arpeggiator, and as soon as you turn it off, the LFO starts not giving a damn about the clock, because it relies on the gate from the ARP, like this. Completely free. Let's see what we can do to have the sync happening without the arpeggiator on. In the rear panel, there is a clock out output, which outputs the internal clock on the grandmother. So if we connect the clock output to the sync in, and we turn the ARP on, we have the following. Turn ARP on, press play. So pretty similar to the previous scenario. Now one would say, if I turn the ARP off, the clock should still come out from the back and the grandmother, go into the sync in, and allow me to modulate the rate of the LFO through the ARP sec rate, right? Wrong. Let me show you what I mean. So like this you have, every time there is a note, the LFO is restarted, right? If I turn the ARP off, completely free. Here, nothing comes out. In order for the clock to come out from this output all the time, regardless if the ARP is on or off, we need to change one global setting. And to do that, we need to do some weird voodoo ritual, like pressing a precise combination of buttons and then keys. So I will put a link in the description to the manual listing all the voodoo practices, but for this one we have to do the following. First, you press hold and sync for a while until the sync blinks. Then we have to hold F#2 and press G#1 to enter the setting we want to change, and then we press G0 to change the setting to send the damn clock always. Then we have to say Al-Kazan 3 times on the beat. No, I'm kidding, we're done. But the clock should always now be sent regardless of the ARP on or off. Let's see if we have that. So ARP is on, and now you have to exit. ARP is on. ARP is off. Cool, we got something. Basically, we have like 16 notes with respect to our clock, internal clock coming from the rhythm, but we cannot change it. We cannot do divisions. The only division available is 16 by default. This is because there is another voodoo global setting that can be adjusted, which is the pulse per quarter note, but it's very inconvenient to change. Imagine you're playing live and you want to change the LFO division from 16s to 8s, and then you have to press and hold sync and then press, I don't know, F#2, then G1, then blah. It's just unpractical. The good news is that there is an ultimate way to sync the LFO without any limitation, opening up a lot of creative possibilities. But the bad news is that you will need a CV sequencer, like this one. So we feed the 8-step with the same clock that we give to the grandmother, and let's connect the CV output of the pedal to the sync in the grandmother and see what we get. We build a very simple pattern where we open the gate, so we send, I think, a 5 volts and then a 0, 5, 0, 5, 0. So this is basically, should be an 8 note. If we press play, of course, send the signal, transport is going. Then, like this, with that nothing, we bring the modulation in and we should have 8 notes for the modulation. And now we can do any division we want. We can press hold, triplets, even 32s. Follows the tempo changes, of course. And of course, every time we change division, we have to change the rate to adapt. But this opens up a lot of possibilities, right? You can play with the rate, you get like different grooves, but you can also like start having like different grooves. I love how with an external sequencer you can just mess around with your trigger sequence, not a clock anymore, and sync with the LFO without any problem, without any voodoo pressing button here and there, and with one single patch cable. Let's do a 30-second jam and see what superpowers we got with this guy. This brings us to the end of this video, where I show you some different ways that you can sync up your LFO to your external clock source, be it a sequencer, a DAW, or any trigger sequence that is not necessarily at regular intervals, by means of the sync in input. The ultimate way that I found that has no limitations for my needs or any voodoo skills required is by means of a CV sequencer. Today we use this 8-step program, but I know for a fact that Arturia bitstep also work, and I'm sure that many other sequencers out there are suitable for this procedure. For all the methods that I described, we need to manually tune the LFO frequency to make it work, and this might be considered by some a bug, but by some others a feature. I personally like that we have an extra knob to sculpt our groove and make it more interesting, and that is not automatically locked to the sync in signal that we send in. If you like this video, please consider subscribing if you want to see more content like this one, and push the thumb up before you go. Stay synced and see you next time!